This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. This morning, and I say this morning, which is always at risk because the morning means it's morning to us, which sounds a little discriminatory because it might in fact be the evening, the afternoon, nighttime, and you might even be listening to this in the bathtub, wherever you are. This is a message, an episode this morning from the Compass Point series of Respectonomics. The Compass Point series is designed to help us navigate the trials, tribulations, and all the bits and pieces in life. And what we have today is the Voice of Respectonomics, which is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley, and co-host Sarah Benton. And I will now say quite correctly, good morning.
Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning, Sarah. Okay, and what we're going to be talking about this morning is an expression that is, at one level, is horrifically financial. If you're an accountant, if you're an investor or an investment banker, if you're an underwriter, it's an expression that you've heard so often and so familiar with, you're almost wondering, why would you center it out? And the centerpiece this morning is, the center of our discussion is earnings per share. And before we go any further, Sarah, tell me, if you hear the expression earnings per share, does that give you a feeling of warm, fuzzy wuzzies? Or does it by any chance give you a feeling of, oh, one of those discussions?
I'm going to go with option number 2.
Okay, you're far too polite to say, oh.
Oh.
Okay, now we've got it. Okay, no, we're going to be talking about earnings per share because it's an expression that is very bandied around in the financial world. But yes. I think it has enormous social implications that are not fully, I shouldn't say are not, but they may not be fully grasped and fully used to advantage. The earnings of a company, at one level, you would say is quite straightforward. You would think in terms of a business sells stuff, gets money through the front door, and then it has its expenses that go out the back door, and the difference between the two is the earnings.
Right.
If you are from a MBA, Masters of Business Administration, or an accounting background, you would shudder at that description because you would start saying things like, yes, but what's included in the revenue and what's included in the expenses? And you get things like deferred expenses, you get things like accounts receivable, and you get recapturing capital cost allowances. And if your head isn't spinning already, then you're not normal. In other words, these are head-spinning subjects. Right. And that, in a way, is one of the most crucial points of looking at this financial phenomenon of earnings per share, because it is, in fact, a very complex calculation, and one for which there's not, there's not really a definitive answer. You get into things like, oh, but what about the cash flow per share? And the list goes on. And I really don't want to sort of trap ourselves into a full-scale financial unwrapping of this. But I think what is fair to say is this. A business has a certain amount of profit at the end of a period, normally the end of a quarter or the end of a year. And when you look at any kind of business, whether it's the local bakery or whether it's Amazon, it doesn't really matter. But all of these companies have shareholders. And these shareholders own shares in the company. That's how they become, it's where the word shareholder comes from. You hold shares in that company. So if you do the multiplications, what you end up with is you've got a profit, let's say, of $100 at the end of the year, if you're running the bakery. And we'll assume that there are two people, a brother and a sister, who run the bakery. They each have an equal share in the business. So there are two shares in that particular bakery. There's $100 of profit. 100 divided by 2 is 50. So the profit per share, the earnings per share in that instance is $50. Now multiply that all out and you say, well, my corporation had net profit of $1 trillion or $1 billion, and we have X million shares outstanding that are in all these people's hands, owned by pension funds and institutions and so on. So you got all that sort of rollout of all these shares, you've got the rollout of the profits. And then you say, well, if I divide the profits by the number of shares, we will now know how many shares there are. And sorry, something's just come off my screen. Anyway, the point of all this is that's the earnings per share. Do we need to go any further than that? Is that mathematically okay?
Yeah, I think that's deep enough.
Deep enough. Good. Let's leave it at that. Okay. However, there are two or three questions, though, that address the bench with this business of earnings per share. Mm-hmm. Because when a corporation at its annual meeting says our earnings per share were $10 a share, let's just say that, it's an easy number, $10 a share. One of the most crucial questions is the $10 is fine. What do we mean by per share? Because in the mathematical sense, we mean the number of shares outstanding. Okay. But surely to goodness, a corporation is made up, or any business is made up of many shareholders. And the shareholders are represented by the people who put the money in. That's the investor. The shareholders are represented by the employee. The shareholders are represented by the customer and, of course, by the supplier.
Right.
So all of those are the integral commitments of individuals to a or individuals of institutions, if you will, or components to a business. And why the earnings per share is very important is, and corporations need to do this, is to expand on it to say, how do those earnings get distributed? Who are the real shareholders? Because the real shareholder is not only the one who is what you might call the one who owns the stock, which is where a company traditionally goes. And the reason I say this is that so many companies are so beholden to the idea of earnings per share that the other people, the other components, the employee, the customer, the supplier, are often left in the dust. And I think, therefore, what we want to do with earnings per share is to examine the whole concept of per share and to find out who is sharing in the profitability of the company. I think taking that rather capitalistic, almost fascist view that, well, if those are the profits of the company, they belong to their shareholders, I think that is too narrow a description. That people give their lives to a corporation, they give their, and sometimes it's they give their savings to the company, they go and buy something from that company. There's a lot of stuff that's going on that truly needs to be respected. And I think one of the greatest mistakes with earnings per share is that it doesn't fully explain who the real shareholders are and who's made the commitment to the business and how it's all come together. You've been to annual meetings, I've been to annual meetings, when you hear lines like, and our most important strength is our people.
Right.
And it's said, but I have a horrible feeling it is precisely that. It is said. And I think if we looked at it the other way around and said the earnings of the company are A and B and C amounts of money, and they all resulted from these four constituencies, and we would like to address each one. We would like to address the shareholder who was the one who took the risk and put the money there in the first place. We would like to talk to the employee who has given life and soul and heart to the business and comes to work every day, quite often at weekends, maybe at night time, disrupts their family life. We would like to talk to the customer who is actually the lifeblood of the business, who has made these share profits even possible. And we would like to talk to the suppliers whose reliability, who the content of what they do and what they produce is exactly what we can turn into added value. I think that's a fair way of looking at earnings per share. Now, the other thing is, again, why I think earnings per share needs to be re-examined and rethought. You may have noticed that when we started this conversation, you had a sort of almost a visceral, we don't really want to get into the inner workings of earnings per share. You could hear your voice and your body language saying, no, Jeremy, we don't want to go too far on that. Well, actually, I think we do. I don't think we want to go further into it on the basis of whether the earnings are fully diluted and blah, 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 blah. We'll let the accountants do that. That that's okay. But
Yes.
what I do want to emphasize, though, is we as a society need to explore far more carefully, far more sensitively what these earnings really, really represent.
I
And
think it's about how it's applicable to respectonomics,
what is applicable
right?
to respectonomics, because respectonomics keeps on the one theme of dignifying the other human being. And
Exactly.
if we're going to dignify the other human being, then the earnings per share is one vehicle that can be used to produce or to bring this into effect. I do agree that the shareholder ultimately is entitled to those earnings. They have the what you call the ownership of those earnings, but ownership, as we all know in life, is a shared responsibility. You know, if you ever go up to somebody and you say, "Whose car is that?" The standard answer is, "Oh, that's our car."
Right.
What it means is there's a joint ownership, a joint responsibility to that car or whatever it is with your spouse, children, whoever it might be. And what we're trying to emphasize here is that shared responsibility and the shared contribution that has brought these earnings to the table. Now, sorry, you were going to say.
I was going to say, can you tell me about value versus emotion while we're talking about kind of ownership or
Well, this is an extraordinarily important point because one of the if you look at a corporation,
Mhm.
we very quickly lose sight of the difference between value and emotions.
Mhm.
Emotions are the things that run prices up and down by the moment. And they're very valuable. I mean, it's a valuable tool, but they are the sort of thing that says to you, hey, I'm going to get that before it goes off the shelf. We get into that kind of emotional thing. But it's very interesting how often we find that what we do emotionally does
Mhm.
not stand the test of value.
Mm. Interesting.
In other words, we do things that really, and again, what I think a corporation needs to do is to get off the chutzpah of the grins and the forecasting earnings and all that, and talk again about the value of those earnings, because those value of those earnings are in fact a direct corollary of the value of the human being that's made them possible.
Mm.
Whether it's buyer, seller, employee, or supplier, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is the value is more important than the emotion. And
Mm.
one of the problems with emotions is they do tend to get us into tangles. We all know that. We all do things emotionally. As a matter of
Correct.
fact, I've heard it said that our behavior is modified by our emotions, which I
Very true.
think is a fair statement. And
Yes.
one of the problems you get in this focus on earnings is
Mhm.
so many businesses stand up and say our quarterly earnings are A, B, and C. And they get all excited about it because their bonuses depend on it. The
Mhm.
job depends on it, and so on. And I think while there has to be responsible understanding of the earnings, I mean, naturally, if you think about it, the earnings should be more like a yardstick of saying we're doing the right thing. They
Mhm.
should be an expression of, yes, you put the business in the right place at the right time. Fine. But the value needs to be emphasized over and over again, because this is why we get into this ghastly problem today, where you see this incredible discrepancy between them at the top and them at the
Mhm.
bottom. Putting it
Right.
in black and white English, you get the corporate leader taking away 10, $20 million, and they can't give a pay raise to somebody who's making $19 an hour.
Right.
The imbalance in that, the discrepancy is, well, frankly, socially or morally, is unacceptable. And if you use a value kind of proposition to understanding the earnings of the company, those are values that tell you that business is not sustainable.
Tell me about dividends.
The dividends are what we would reasonably expect out of the earnings. When a company has earnings, they will make, let's say this is $10, and they say, well, we need $5 to go back into replacing the machine or the mill or whatever it is that needs to be done. So there's money that goes back into the business. A hotel, for example, will puts money aside every year because they need to refurbish. Statistically, they need to refurbish a room every 7 years.
Okay.
So you want a reserve to be able to do that. And then there's money you might commonly call leftover. And that's the dividend that comes out of the profits of the company. Now, here's a really interesting, quirky thing that really puts the chief financial officer on their heels. And that's this question. If the business is so successful and doing so well, and you can tell me that you are doing so well, why are you paying out dividends at all? Because in theory, the money should be kept in the business because the money that's in the business will do better than anything I can do with it.
Right.
And it's only a question. I think we could
Mm.
probably get ourselves into lots of philosophical discussions on, yes, but I need the cash or whatever it
Right.
is you need out of it. And I mean, they're all fair answers. But it is also a point to remind those companies that the earnings are a yardstick of how the companies, it's like a barometer. How are you doing?
Right.
And in a way, although you say, well, I want to see the earnings rising, that's, should we say, obvious. But it is also true to say that you want those earnings to be growing in a manner that people can say, my money is being used very wisely and efficiently. I mean, we've got a situation at the moment where one of the major telecommunications companies has actually cut the dividend by 56%. And that's because they've made some lousy business decisions. And on top of that, have inherited an incredible amount of debt. But I want to tell
Mhm.
you one other thing about that company. I'm not
Yes.
naming it, but
Okay.
I'll just say telecommunications. But you know something fascinating? You never hear a good word about them. If you
Mm.
call them up and you say, my Wi-Fi or whatever it is isn't working, how often do you get to a call center that could not give one fig about you or me?
Hmm.
And I find it very, very interesting that the interpolation of lousy customer service effectively has now translated into a significant reduction in dividends.
Right. Well, you would think that eventually that would catch up,
Bingo. It is.
right?
And that's why we keep going back to this whole
Big
concept.
picture.
Yeah, we keep coming back to the dignity of the human being. We keep coming back to looking after your employee and your shareholder and so on. So when you focus on earnings per share and you say that's the be all and end all, if you're ignoring the values of the people that make this all possible,
Mhm.
eventually those earnings will not be sufficient.
It's funny, and I'm going to equate that too, because how often do you hear? So this is not specific to the telecommunications
Mm,
company. I think it's kind of across the board in different
mm,
lines of business. How often do you hear that companies are more apt to treat a potential newer client
hmm.
better than the ones that have been loyal and that
Yeah,
are there?
it's
I can
exactly.
equate that
Yeah,
to employees as well,
yeah.
right?
I think it's one of your expressions, and I think you talk about the value proposition. Isn't
Mm.
that one of your cornerstone ways
Yes.
of looking at things? And you're absolutely right. The value proposition of a retained employee who has shown loyalty and diligence and hard work, all of those things. And it's fascinating how, as you rightly point out, new person on the block gets more attention.
Hmm.
And those ghastly comparisons that are made. We're so pleased to have this new person here and you can almost hear in brackets, they're so much better than you.
Right.
I mean, it's incredibly demeaning.
Yes. Or even you as a client, why are you more valuable when I've
Oh,
showed you
yeah,
loyalty?
yeah,
Right?
yeah. No,
Why
I
do they
mean,
get better
yeah,
pricing when
yeah,
I've been a client
yeah,
all along and paid my bills
yeah,
on time?
yeah.
And, anyway, we could
It,
go around for circles on that on
well, it's
days.
not a circle, really. I think Peter Drucker, the late Peter Drucker, who was the sort of the management guru,
Mhm.
I think he got it absolutely right that he said when you're talking to your employees and you're asking them to do something, you treat them like they were volunteers.
Mhm.
You treat them with that degree of respect. Would you mind taking on this, please? You've done such a good job on A, B, and C. We'd love you now, please, to take a look at D, E, and F.
Right.
And that kind of approach should be applied to the shareholders, it should be applied to the suppliers, it should be applied to everybody joining the organization. You've heard me talk about this one line from my famous, I call famous, famous to me, Uncle David. Uncle David in London, England, was extraordinarily successful, and he's no longer with us. And I said to him one day, why have you been so successful? And the answer was, he said in that lovely English drawl, he said, what we do is any decisions we make have to be fair to the new people joining the firm. And then he paused and said, you see, we've had our turn.
Mm.
I mean, what
Interesting.
greater respect could there be for the people who have put their shoulders to the wheel and now they want to make a legacy succession to give the same opportunity to the younger people coming in?
Right. Right.
So, anyway, that's
To sum
earnings per
up,
share. Did you have anything else you want?
just to sum up,
Hmm.
tell me about complexity versus reasonable expectations to kind of
Ah,
summarize
mhm.
us and end us off here.
Well, I think you and I got into a sort of almost went down that ghastly rabbit hole of understanding earnings per share.
Mhm.
And I mean, the only giveaway was you didn't say to me, well, what does diluted earnings per share mean? You were very careful not to ask that question.
Yes.
And again, what we should understand is the complexities of earnings are significant. They really are. They're
Yes.
not easy to understand. There's different opinions on what should be included, excluded, whether inventory is old, new, or whatever. The list goes on and on and on. And that's why you get these courses in finance degrees that deal with some of these lines on a one by one basis for months, trying to
Right.
understand them and how they can be applied and so on. And what I really want to sum up is this. I think it's more important to ignore the complexities of these rabbit holes and warrens and all this kind of stuff, and to look at the values of the company, to
Mm.
look at the way that they express their loyalty to their employees, their customers, and so on. But when you see those values being represented, when you believe that they are true to their word,
Mhm.
Sir Richard Branson, Virgin Airlines, if you call him, he'll take your call. If
Right.
you have an idea, he'll sit you down. If he likes the idea, he says, let's give it a go. I mean, this is somebody who's being spontaneous, responsible, but actually is engaging with you. That's the kind of value that makes a lot of sense. And if I told to somebody, I have two companies, one with these values and the other one that makes earnings per share of A, B, and C, I think most people would say, give me the one with the values,
Mhm.
because those are the values that are lasting and they are good for business, they're
Mhm.
good for humanity, and ultimately respect the environment.
It's funny, I equate that or I think about that in terms of culture,
Yeah,
right?
very much that. And I mean, what's that
There's,
expression? Culture eats strategy before breakfast.
yes,
But if you've got the
every single time.
Mhm.
And then you'll also have companies or organizations or groups or whatever platform that is where they speak the culture, or let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
They tell you what the culture is, but do they actually impart and and use or implement what the actual culture is? You can say it all day long, but do you practice it? Maybe that's a better word. Do you
Well,
practice it? Do you show it? Do you articulate it?
okay, here we go. Here's the time-honored sales question, because the senior officer says, these are our values. Da da
Right.
da 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 da. Fine. And then you look at that individual and you say, how do you verify your information for accuracy, consistency, and reliability? Accuracy means you've kept records of what you've said. Consistency means you've been doing it all the time, and reliability means you've been doing it for a long time.
Mm.
If you can prove that you've done those three, you get my vote.
And on that note,
I rest my case.
thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sarah, so much.